Hello everyone and welcome back to the history of the First Crusades, where last time we saw the main leaders of the Prince's Crusade making their various ways across Europe, crossing into Anatolia, where they not only took Nicaea but defeated Kilij Aslan's army in a massive battle at Dorylaeum, putting them in a really good position to now continue marching onwards towards Antioch. And it is the march and siege of Antioch that we'll be focusing on today. Now, this massive blow to the Sultan, he stopped being the Crusaders' main threat. Instead, the weather became their greatest enemy. This was both extreme heat during the day and extreme cold at night. At the same time, their supplies began to very rapidly dwindle, and thirst, lack of food, and simple exhaustion began to take a hold on the entirety of the crusading army. A very, very large loss initially was of the horses, which was very major not just as pack animals, but also as the major weapon of the mounted crusading knights. At this point, the crusading army broke up. Tancred and Baldwin pushed directly to the city of Konya, whereas the main army went to the fertile land around Pisidian Antioch for better foraging. There they moved really quite slowly, about 5 to 10 miles a day, having to resort to using goats, sheep and dogs as pack animals, whereas the knights would ride cows or simply walk. The army reunited at Konya, but at this point likely thousands had already died. Raymond of Toulouse was so gravely ill during this that he had been given his last rites. He would recover, but even a great lord having to nearly succumb to exhaustion and starvation really shows how bleak things were getting. And it wasn't just the weather that was the problem, but just the local inhabitants. Notably, Godfrey of Bouillon was supposedly injured by a bear attack during this crossing of Asia Minor. Now, it seemed this would be the Sultan's ideal time to counterstrike and wipe out the Christian army, but he was really facing a massive Christian revolt all across his lands. Did manage to put up one pitched battle at Heraclea in mid-September, but that was another defeat for the Sultan. The army again then split after this battle. In late September, early October, Tancred and Baldwin led two groups through Cilicia, but although these two had travelled already before, last time the armies broke apart, they were not friends. They had a very, very intense rivalry, coming to blows at numerous occasions. Very notably, Baldwin is accused of assisting the Muslims to massacre 300 knights that were meant to reinforce Tancred, sent by Bohemond, Baldwin there putting his own rivalry ahead of the interests of the crusade. But this small breakaway group did a vital job for the rest of the Crusades. They gained foraging grounds for the main army, cleared the entire southern flank, and they left behind loyal leaders at Tarsus, and Tancred left behind leaders at Namistra and Bagras. While they were pushing through Cilicia, the main army turned north. Partially this was to secure the Armenian Christian support to hold the northern passages from the Turks. It took this army 7 weeks to cross the 400 miles to Antioch, averaging about 8 miles a day. Now, while Tancred would return to the main army and march with them to Antioch, Baldwin, on the other hand, in mid-October, broke away completely from the crusading army. He was persuaded by a local Armenian called Bagrat to leave the army, and he arrived at Tel Bashir, where he was welcomed as the new lord of the town by the local Armenians. And this little sojourn to grab his own personal territory didn't end there. In February 1098, he was invited by the ruler of Edessa, a man called Thoros, to help against an advancing army being sent by Kerboga of Musul, which was on its way to relieve the siege of Antioch. Now, Baldwin here proved to be really quite underhand in his attempts to gain himself power. He accepted Thoros' invitation, taking with him about 80 knights east of the Euphrates to help out on the condition that he be named Thoris's heir. On the 20th of February, he arrived at Edessa, where he very quickly colluded with local dissidents to stage an uprising. He then stood back and watched as his new adopted father was lynched by a mob. On the 10th of March, Baldwin then assumed control of Edessa. And this is very notable, as Edessa would become the first of what would be known as the Frankish states in the Levant, the first of what would later be known as Outremer, this Christian enclave that was carved out by the First Crusade. And despite certainly being completely self-centered, going off from the Crusade to seek his own glory, his capture of Edessa would prove vital in the coming siege of Antioch. On the 21st of October 1097, the Crusaders finally arrived at the outskirts of Antioch. Now, Antioch only had a few thousand defenders, but still was not going to be easy at all for the Crusaders to take. It had 7.5 miles of defensive walls, including multiple towers sprinkled along them. On top of that, the terrain was rough and mountainous, making any attack difficult. And then within the walls itself was Mount Silpius, and on the summit of this mountain, 1,000 feet above the city, was the citadel, both of which would have to be taken for the Crusaders to be able to claim control of Antioch. So it's definitely a difficult objective, and so the obvious question is, why are the Crusaders worrying about this? They're meant to be going after Jerusalem, and there's a number of different reasons. From the Crusaders' point of view, one of the major ones was that Antioch effectively controlled the ports of Alexandretta, St. Simeon, and Latakia, all of which would be vital for being able to get more supplies in, since really the supply routes now would have to go through the Mediterranean, rather than following the Crusaders' rather disastrous path through Asia Minor. It was also very important for Alexius, the Crusaders' patron, as he really wanted to reclaim Antioch, notably because this would very much secure Asia Minor, helping him expand the borders back to where they would have been before the Battle of Manzikert. The other reason why Alexius was very much in favour of a crusade push towards Antioch was that it would be a major distraction for the Seljuk Sultan in Baghdad, and if the Sultan was distracted, then the Fatimids could move north from Egypt and attack Jerusalem. And at this point, Alexius was very much allied to the Fatimids, as we saw last time, both being on opposite sides of the Seljuks, who they both considered to be an enemy. Now, on top of this, we saw the rather power-hungry Bohemond last time, who had formed an alliance with Alexius, and it is very possible that Bohemond expected that he himself would receive lordship of the city because of that alliance, and so he would have been pushing to fulfill Alexius's aims and take the city, mostly for his own benefit. Now, the siege lasted for a very long time, but at no point was the city ever fully blockaded. The Crusaders simply lacked the manpower to completely surround and invest the city. So throughout the siege, men, material, and intel could pass through the crusading lines and get into the city. Another serious problem with this lack of a complete blockade was that the garrison could raid the besiegers at will, and they would do this throughout the siege, running light raids, making sure the Crusaders never felt safe and comfortable outside the walls. Now, slowly over the course of the siege, a series of counterforts were constructed opposite the major gates. First of these went up in November 1097, north of the city. By March 1098, another had been built blocking Bridgegate, which led down to St. Simeon Port. And April 1098, finally, George Gate had its counterfort constructed, and this was all the major gates fully surrounded at that point. But otherwise, there was a major deadlock with the siege. the Crusaders did not have the men and resources or siege equipment to force their way into the city. Meanwhile, the defenders within the city were too few in number to do anything but raid the Crusaders, and so things settled down in a bit of a stalemate. Now, that was standard for medieval warfare. Sieges would very often last until the defenders were forced to surrender for supply issues, but in the crusading case, the attackers themselves were deeply out of supply, and this became even more of a problem approaching December 1097. To combat the complete lack of supply, a major foraging expedition was launched. Bohemond and Robert of Flanders went south through the Orontes Valley towards Albara, and here they met with disaster. They ran into a relief force that had been sent from Homs and Damascus in order to relieve the siege of Antioch. This was led by Dakuk of Damascus, and although the Crusaders technically kept the field, they had received very, very heavy losses and were forced to abandon their foraging expedition. And this is where things almost reached breaking point. Without supplies and with the foraging attempts failing, there started to be mass starvation of men and horses. And the death of the horses would come back to bite the Crusaders again and again. On top of that, with the lack of supplies and dwindling prospects, desertion started to become rampant. Notably, even high-ranking members of the Crusade started attempting to leave. One such attempted deserter was Peter the Hermit, who had joined with the rest of the crusading forces after they had arrived following his own horrible expedition, and he attempted to flee but was caught in trying to do so and so brought back to the group. Bohemond also considered leaving at this point, really starting to feel a bit of defeatism within the crusading camp at this point. Part of the big attraction of desertion at this point was its relative ease. With the nearby ports controlled and with the seas very much in the hands of the Christian relief fleets, fleeing via sea was certainly possible and relatively easy for these crusaders. And so, faced with either a very uncertain future continuing the siege or simply cutting their losses and go home, plenty of people abandoned their oaths here and turned back towards mainland Europe. Now, the Crusaders certainly didn't just sit on their hands during this. The leadership did move. In particular, the papal legate, Adheimer of Lipoi, did put through a series of measures aimed to try and restore morale, starting off with penitential fasting, prayers for divine intercession, and also processions and almsgiving for all of the laity, trying to make everyone feel part of this communal effort. Not only did this help shake off defeatism within the camp, but those alms that were collected were donated into a communal fund, which was what was paying for the construction of the defensive forts and the purchase of new horses to replace those that were starving. At the same time of this clergy response to the crisis, there was also a secular crackdown on general law and order. Very notably, all women, including wives of the Crusaders, were removed from the camp, this being seen as perhaps a sign of degeneracy and lack of faith, and so wanted to move these people outside and get the soldiers also focusing on the actual war effort. At the same time, to reinforce this idea of piety, there was public humiliation, which involved stripping and whipping of any found adulterers within the camp. Now, things did start to improve. The army did receive a steady stream of reinforcements, both from the west via shipping lines and from Byzantium, their patron at this point. But it was never quite enough, and the Crusaders were constantly in a state of almost breaking. To make matters even worse, the Greek general Tatakios, who had been accompanying the crusade, left the siege in February of 1098. He said that he wanted to gather supplies and reinforcements, but from the Crusaders' point of view, this was seen as a massive betrayal, and we will certainly see that coming up again in the future. It may also have been the case that his leaving was encouraged by Bohemond, who, let's just say, was plotting his own chain of events right now. Now, as the siege of Antioch dragged on, it certainly was getting attention from a lot of local Muslim rulers, as we've already seen Damascus and Homs sent relief armies. On the 8th of February 1098, Ridwan of Aleppo sent another relief army. This one was met once again by a force commanded by Bohemond, who defeated the army near the Lake of Antioch to the northeast of the city. Now, what we're seeing here is a series of quite surprising victories despite the supply situation for the Crusaders, and a large part of that is that the remaining Crusaders at this point were now a really quite hardened core of veterans who had been used to fighting these large pitched battles, whereas many of the non-combatants or less skilled or less determined members had either been killed or had already fled, just leaving this elite troop behind. Not only that, but the Crusaders held their lines partially simply because there was no other option. They knew that they would be absolutely wiped out if they were defeated. They were well into enemy territory, trying to retreat back across Asia Minor and reach the safety of Byzantium was very much not likely. But hold on, the Crusaders did. By March 1098, not only had an English supply fleet arrived, which temporarily helped ease the supply situation, but by now all of the counterforts had been constructed, and so all of the major gates to the city were now blockaded. Still was not completely cut off. People could still get into and out of the city via rope ladders, but this at least severely limited the enemy's ability to raid from inside the city. But this stalemate could only last for so long, and it would be broken by Kaboga, the Atabeg of Mosul. In spring 1098, Kaboga formed a coalition of groups from Damascus, Anatolia, and northern Iraq, really filling a power vacuum that had been left behind by the Crusaders' pretty much destruction of the Sultanate of Rum. This was a gathering of those that were hostile to both the Fatimids and the Crusaders, as well as Ridwan of Aleppo and the Armenian Christians in general. In theory, this group was loyal to the Seljuk Sultan in Baghdad, but it's a bit unclear as to exactly how loyal they were. Now, on the way to Antioch, Kaboga did stop by Edessa in May 1098 for a 3-week-long siege. This was really his attempts to form a new Syrian power, and again, likely one that wouldn't be very loyal to the Seljuks once he had power. However, he abandoned this 3-week siege of Edessa and moved on to Antioch. Still, this delay of the siege would buy the Crusaders precious time, but in late May the Crusaders learned that Kaboga's army was only a few days away. This resulted in an emergency meeting being called on the 29th of May, and during this meeting Bohemond was given leadership of the Crusades, and very notably he was promised that he could keep control of the city if he was able to capture it before Kaboga's army arrived, with a stipulation insisted by Adheimer and Tancred that this would only take place if no Byzantine reinforcements arrived. Adheimer was wanting to keep to the original vows of the Crusades made to Alexius, and Tancred had his own designs on the city. Even with Bohemond's assurance, desertions very quickly increased, and very importantly, Stephen of Blois was one of the major defectors who left the Crusading camp, and we will see him later. Now, Bohemond's promises of being able to take the city in a few days, given that they had been stalled for months, wasn't completely out of the blue. He had in secret been in contact with an Armenian dissident within Antioch, a man known as Firuz. This had likely been a long time in planning, well before the emergency meeting, Bohemond was just using this emergency meeting as a way of playing his hand here. And contact across the lines was very common. As I said, the city wasn't under complete lockdown under any point during the siege, and the local Christian Armenians within the city would very often contact the Crusaders. Now, Firuz was in command of a section of the wall, and he would be commanding that wall on the night of the 2nd of June, and this was when Bohemond would strike. Along with Godfrey of Bouillon, Robert of Flanders, he led a small group of troops into the city, with Firuz opening the gates for them. Tancred, Count Raymond, and Adheimer all knew of this plan, and they rallied the main army the following morning to follow through this breach in the wall. The local garrison was completely taken by surprise, and they fled to the citadel, leaving the city to be plundered. Yagusin, the ruler of the city, attempted to flee, but he was killed by local Christians while attempting to get to the citadel. And the Crusaders here were cutting this incredibly short. A day later, Kerboga's army arrived. Now, as Kerboga's army arrived, the Crusaders suddenly found themselves in pretty much a worse situation than they had been a few days ago. Yes, they had the city, but they had very, very few supplies. The city had been under siege for a while, so there was very little within the city itself. And not only that, but they found themselves in a siege within a siege. They held the city, but the city's defenders held the citadel in its heart, and so they were both besieging the citadel while at the same time being besieged by the much larger coalition army. By the 7th of June, the city was completely under siege. A week later, the last Christian outpost on the outskirts of the city had been taken, and on the 10th of June there was very heavy fighting around the citadel. Now, once again, morale absolutely collapsed. Many fled overnight using rope ladders to escape into the local countryside. At this point, only about 30,000, including non-combatants, remained within the Christian army, so about half of what they started with when they crossed the Bosphorus. Now, at times like this, the Crusaders were definitely praying for a miracle, and they were handed a couple. The first came from a provincial priest named Stephen of Valence, who had experienced a vision of Christ, the cross, Mary, and St. Peter being the patron saint of Antioch. In this vision, he was meant to be promised that relief would come in 5 days if the Christians demonstrated faith with prayers, ceremonies, and penitence. Now, Stephen was asked to swear on the gospel. Once he did, Adheimer, the papal legate, was happy to accept these visions, and he organized a renewal of oaths and a large ceremony. Now, more controversially, a provincial pilgrim known as Peter Bartholomew claimed to have been receiving visions for the last months of St. Andrew being St. Peter's brother, and in these visions he was supposedly shown where the Holy Lance was buried. He was also promised that relief would arrive within 5 days. However, the Crusaders were not as quick to accept this, particularly Adheimer. Large part of why they thought that these visions were fraudulent and why he had not been promised to find the Lance of Longinus in the Cathedral of St. Peter is that the crusading leadership had already seen the Holy Lance. It was on display in Constantinople in the Imperial Palace. They had already found the lance, they knew where it was, it had been around for a long time. But still needing something, Peter and 12 others were allowed to dig around the Cathedral of St. Peter, where he had been told to look for this, and indeed they did find a jagged piece of metal. Now, Peter said this was the point of the lance. Many other people said this was simply a bit of building debris, as you would likely find when digging near any cathedral. But either way, it would lead to a boost of morale. Now, well after the siege, Peter would go through a trial by fire where he walked across a flaming pathway to prove the validity of his claim. He would die of his injuries during this, so that put rather a downer on any belief in his claims, but all of this took part after the fighting. His promise and his finding of something in this Cathedral of St. Peter was enough to give a bit of a boost to the Crusaders. On the 27th of June, Peter the Hermit was sent into Kerboga's camp with an interpreter. This was likely a gesture of defiance more than any kind of real request to come to terms, and the next day Bohemond seized upon the temporary boost of morale, and on the 28th of June, Bohemond led the Crusaders on a surprise breakout. They moved in close-ordered, coordinated columns. Remember, at this point these were very veteran, trained troops that were left. Now, Crusaders did have a major disadvantage that they really had a lack of horses, and so even the knights were mostly on foot during this. But they did take the Muslim force by surprise, and they managed to initially throw back and outflank the forward divisions before completely routing them. And they did this before the main force could actually manage to engage. And even though the bulk of the rest of the Muslim army was intact and still outnumbered the Crusaders, seeing their forward troops be utterly destroyed, they crumbled. Kerboga himself fled, his camp was overrun, and was thoroughly looted, nicely bringing the Crusaders some more food and supplies, which was desperately needed. Now, of course, the Crusaders were, of course, going to honour this apparent miracle with some nice, devout behaviour, and so every single Muslim that was captured, including the women in the camp, were all massacred after this. And this is something we will certainly see next time, happening again and again. But with the defeat of Kerboga's army, the garrison in the citadel surrendered shortly after, and the Crusaders, despite all odds, found themselves in control of Antioch. And we'll wait until next time to look at the fallout of this, where the Crusader leadership starts squabbling over who gets to keep the city, the actions of Stephen of Blois, who met Alexius's reinforcing army, and we will also look on as this crusading army eventually reluctantly continues their march south to Jerusalem. Until then, I hope you found this informative, useful, or entertaining, and I hope that I catch you in the next video. Till then, cheers.